On the 11th of May, 1945, a 22-year-old economics student from Keio University climbed into a Type 3 fighter at Shiran Air Base, pointed it toward the American fleet off Okinawa, and flew deliberately to his death. His name was Ryoji Uehara. On the night before, this young man handed a stack of papers to an Army newscrew member, and on those papers, in his own hand, he had written that authoritarian and totalitarian states would be defeated in the end, that the victory of liberty was, in his words, evident. Then Uehara went and died for the very authoritarian state he had just predicted would lose. That contradiction is the subject of this film. These are the men who wrote letters before they died, the Kamikaze pilots of Japan's special attack units. And what those letters actually say, when you read them without the propaganda layered on either side, is almost nothing like what you have been told. They were not the fanatics of the American caricature. They were not the joyful martyrs of the Japanese myth. They were something far stranger, far more human, and far more disturbing than either of those two cartoons. This is the story of the words they left behind, and of everyone who has since tried to control what those words are allowed to mean. To understand the letters, you first have to understand the thing that produced them, and the thing that produced them was desperation dressed up as doctrine. The Japanese called it tako, a word shortened from tokubetsu kogiki, meaning special attack. It described the organized, deliberate use of human beings as guided weapons, and it took several forms, including aircraft flown into ships, human torpedoes called kaiten, rocket-propelled bombs called oka, and explosive motorboats called shinyo. The naval air version carried an official name, the Shinpu Special Attack Unit. Shinpu and Kamikaze are two different readings of the same two written characters, meaning divine wind. Inside Japan, the preferred word was takotai, while Kamikaze was the reading that traveled abroad and then traveled back home again. The program was born from a specific military collapse. In June of 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation was gutted, the experienced air crews were gone, and conventional bombing was accomplishing almost nothing against American air defenses. Into that vacuum stepped Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. By the time Onishi took command of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, according to the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, that command had shrunk to 40 operational aircraft. Onishi's reasoning was cold and arithmetical, resting on the grim calculation that a bomb-laden plane flown directly into a ship was simply more reliable than a plane that dropped its bomb and then tried to survive. One detail here cuts against the story of unanimous fanaticism before that story even begins. Not everyone saluted. Commander Tadashi Minobe, according to the account by Albert Axel and Hideaki Case, told Onishi to his face that suicide operations were, in his own words, outside military tactics. A serving Japanese naval officer looked the father of the kamikaze in the eye and refused. Hold on to that fact, because it matters for everything that follows. Consider what Minobe's refusal actually tells us, because it is doing more work than it first appears to. The popular image of wartime Japan is of a monolith, a nation of interchangeable fanatics moving as one toward death. A monolith, though, does not contain a commander who says no to an admiral and survives to have the refusal recorded. That refusal is evidence of internal disagreement at the highest operational level, at the exact moment the program was being born. If a decorated commander could regard these tactics as a violation of soldiering itself, then the choice facing the young men below him was never a simple binary between loyal enthusiasm and treason. A third position existed, Minobe's position, which held the tactic itself to be a professional and moral error. Most of the pilots lacked the rank to occupy that position safely, yet its very existence proves the space for doubt was real, and it proves that the doubt some of them expressed in private was neither aberrant nor cowardly. That doubt was shared, quietly, even by men with stars on their collars. A structural point sits buried in this, and it returns again and again. The distance between what could be said out loud and what could be privately thought was enormous, and it was enforced by rank and by risk. Minobe could refuse because he held the standing to refuse. A 20-year-old conscript could not. When we read the conscript's dutiful letter and the commander's blunt refusal side by side, we are not necessarily reading two different levels of conviction. We may be reading two different levels of permission. A final piece of the Onishi story belongs here, at the beginning, even though it happened at the very end, because it closes a loop that most tellings leave open. The man who organized these units, who reasoned so coldly that a bomb-laden plane was simply more reliable, did not survive the war he sent thousands of young men to die in. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, Onishi took his own life the following day, leaving behind an apology to the pilots and to their families. Sit with the weight of that. The architect of the program judged himself, in the end, and the verdict he passed on his own conduct was not pride. The verdict was apology. That confession undoes nothing he did, and it should never be sentimentalized into redemption, yet it belongs in the record as one more piece of evidence against the tidy story in which everyone involved believed, cleanly and to the last, in the beauty of the sacrifice. The man at the top of the machine ended by apologizing for it, and somewhere in that gesture lives the whole tension this film is about, the distance between the doctrine a system proclaims and what the people inside it, in their most private and final moments, actually feel about what they have done. Now, the letters themselves. Farewell writing was not invented in 1944. The practice reached back into samurai testamentary tradition and forward into the wartime state cult of dying for the emperor. Pilots were expected to produce a very particular kind of last word, one built from loyalty to the throne, filial duty reframed as service to the state, and above all joy, carried by the image of the young man falling like a cherry blossom, happy to scatter. That was the script they were handed. The cherry blossom deserves a moment of its own, because it stands as the single most important symbol in this entire story, and it was not chosen by accident. In the imagery the state promoted, the blossom stood for a specific idea, the bloom that falls at the very peak of its beauty, scattering while still perfect rather than fading slowly. Mapped onto a young soldier. The meaning was unmistakable and deliberate, telling him to die young, die beautiful, die at your peak, and to consider it not a loss but a fulfillment. The image reframed the destruction of a 20-year-old as a kind of aesthetic completion. That is a coldly efficient piece of ideological engineering, because it takes the most natural human objection to the whole enterprise, the objection that these were young men with entire lives ahead of them, and converts that very objection into the point. The waste becomes the beauty. You will see, when we reach the letters, that some of these young men picked up the blossom imagery and used it themselves. The open question, the one scholars still fight over, is whether they meant by it what the state meant, or something entirely their own. What they actually wrote is where this gets complicated. Here is the first fact that dismantles the popular picture. The men who left behind the famous, literate, agonized letters were not representative of the men who died. They were a minority, and a very particular minority at that. Look at the numbers and hold them as ranges, because the sources genuinely disagree with one another. The total number of pilots who died in these attacks is usually placed somewhere close to 4,000, with PBS American Experience putting it at close to 4,000 airmen. Other framings run higher, and the discussion around Axel and Kay's references a figure of around 6,000 young men across special attacks broadly. For the Okinawa Kikusui operations alone, the historian Stephen Zaloga counts 3,860 aircrew killed. Pick your definition, Navy or Army, aircraft only, or every method, and the number shifts. That is why we give a range and name the source every single time. Now break that population down, because this is the part that changes everything. Drawing on the work of the anthropologist Emiko Onuki-Tierney, the Sage Encyclopedia of the Human Experience describes roughly 4,000 Takotai pilots split into two very different groups. About 3,000 of them were teenage recruits drawn from the newly conscripted enlisted ranks. Close to 1,000 were student soldiers, university students whose graduations had been pushed forward so the state could draft them. Here is the part that matters most. Among the officers who died, student soldiers made up 71% of the Army officers and 85% of the Navy officers. And in Onuki-Tierney's account, the teenage recruits, the numerical majority of the dead, left almost no written legacy at all. Read that again slowly. because it is the hidden architecture under every Kamikaze documentary you have ever seen. The letters that survive, the ones that are beautiful and tormented and full of Kierkegaard and Croce, come overwhelmingly from a small, highly educated slice of the men who died. The 3,000 teenage conscripts, the actual bulk of the dead, are mostly silent. We do not have their inner lives. We have instead the inner lives of the reserve officers pulled from the civilian universities. This connects to something Rikihi Inaguchi and Tadashi Nakajima noticed at the time. In their account, titled The Divine Wind, they observed that the enlisted men and the academy-trained career pilots typically wrote very little, while the reserve officers, pulled out of civilian universities and rushed into cockpits, wrote the most. There are reasons for that gap. Part of the answer is simple education, since the university students had spent years learning to put interior experience into words, and the teenage conscripts, many pulled from farms and factories, had not. Part of it, though, is something sadder and more specific to their situation. The student soldiers had been given, and then had torn away from them, a particular kind of future. They had been walking a path toward degrees, careers, a life of the mind, and the war reached into that path and ended it. A man who has read Kierkegaard and studied economics carries a vivid, detailed picture of exactly what he is being asked to surrender, and that picture demands to be written down. The conscript who never had that future mapped out in front of him may have felt the loss no less. Yet he had fewer words prepared to measure it. So the writing we have is not merely filtered by education. That writing is filtered by the specific grief of interrupted ambition, which means the archive tilts, structurally, toward the men with the most to articulate and the most articulate way to do it. The letters overrepresent a very particular species of loss. A further wrinkle in the numbers themselves rewards close attention. Notice how the proportions invert depending on which slice you examine. Across the whole population of roughly 4,000 dead, the student soldiers formed a minority, roughly a quarter. Among the officers specifically, though, they formed the overwhelming majority, at 71% of the Army officers and 85% of the Navy officers. What that tells you is that the program was, in its officer ranks, disproportionately built out of exactly the men least prepared by career and temperament to accept it, the civilian students, while the career professionals who might have accepted it most readily were the ones, as we will see, declining to volunteer. The composition of the dead was not random. That composition was shaped by who could be compelled and who could not. Think of it like a survey with a catastrophic sampling bias built into it. If you only ever heard from the most literate, most philosophically trained, most self-reflective quarter of a population, and you then generalized their thoughts to the whole, you would be committing a basic methodological error. And that is exactly what most popular accounts of the Kamikaze do. The famous letters are real, but they are not the average. They are the exception that happen to know how to write. Before we meet them individually, hold one idea in mind, because it reframes how you should hear every word that follows. We are about to read the private writing of men who knew, with a precision almost no one else in history has known, the date and the manner of their own deaths. That knowledge does something to language. Most last words in human history are unplanned, a final sentence spoken without anyone knowing it was final. These are the opposite. These were composed by young men who had been told, in effect, that they would die within days, in this specific way, for this specific reason, and who then sat down to write. That is an almost unbearable condition to compose in, and it produces a strange doubled quality in the writing, where the pilot is at once the dying man and the mourner of his own death, writing his own elegy while still breathing. Keep that in your ear. When Tadao Hayashi writes that he does not want to die, he is not speaking in the abstract. Hayashi is a young man who has been handed the date. Let me introduce 3 of these young men specifically, because their names and their words are documented, and because they will carry the rest of this story. First, Ryoji Uehara, the young man from the opening. Uehara studied economics at Keio University, and at 22 years old, in his final essay, a document titled in translation My Thoughts, he did something that should have been impossible for a man about to die for the imperial state. Uehara argued for liberty. Writing plainly, he claimed that if you think with universal theoretical logic, liberty's victory, is evident. Uehara called himself a liberalist and predicted that authoritarian and totalitarian countries would be defeated in the end. Then he handed this essay to an army newscrew member named Toshiro Takagi on the night before his sortie. The essay first reached print in 1949 in the anthology Kaike Watatsumi no Ko, meaning Listen to the Voices of the Sea, and it was translated later by Bill Gordon. There is a second Uehara document, quieter and more devastating than the first. Uehara left a coded message for a woman he loved, a woman named Kyoko whom he could not marry, and he hid it by marking characters inside a book of philosophy. Decoded, the message reads, in translation, Kyoko, farewell, I loved you, and I always will love you. A man flying to his death, and the last thing he wants to smuggle past the censors is not a slogan about the emperor. It is that he loved someone. Second, Ichizo Hayashi. Hayashi was a Christian and a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, and on his final flight he carried three things: a Bible, a copy of Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death, and a photograph of his mother. To that mother he wrote, in the translation preserved at the Kamikaze Images Archive and reproduced in Onuki Tierney's work, words that no propaganda ministry would ever have chosen. Mother, he wrote, I still want to be loved and spoiled by you. I want to be held in your arms and sleep. And in the same breath, I dread death so much, and yet it is already decided for us. I dread death so much. That is a kamikaze pilot, in his own hand, days away from the target. Third, Tadao Hayashi, a student soldier and scout pilot, and one of the central figures in Onuki Tierney's study of these diaries. His diary contains a line that ought to be carved over the entrance of every museum that tells you these men died gladly. I do not want to die, he wrote. I want to live. No, I do not want to die. I feel lonely. Now set those three private voices against the voice the war wanted. Compare them to the letter of Isao Matsuo of the 701st Air Group, which reaches us through Inaguchi and Nakajima and was quoted in Time magazine in 1945. Please congratulate me, Matsuo wrote. I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. I shall fall like a blossom from a radiant cherry tree. That is the sound of the myth. Please congratulate me. A splendid opportunity to die. And here is what you must understand about that quote. It is real, yet it comes to us through a partisan filter, because Inaguchi and Nakajima were Onishi's own staff officers, and they selected the letters they published specifically to convey the spirit, to convey eagerness. That is not a neutral archive. That is a curated one, assembled by the men who ran the program. So we have two archives sitting on top of each other. One, curated by the military and later by the memorial museums, hands us please congratulate me. The other, recovered from private diaries and smuggled notes, hands us I dread death so much and I want to live. Both are authentic. Only one was ever meant to be seen. Here is what makes these three pilots so valuable as evidence, beyond the raw emotional force of their words. In each case, the private register and the expected public register are both visible in the same man. Uehara could produce the language of duty when he needed to, and did, yet the essay he handed to Takagi in the dark and the note he hid inside the philosophy book run in the opposite direction. Ichizo Hayashi carried a Bible and Kierkegaard toward a target, an act saturated with the vocabulary of sacrifice, and in the same motion wrote to his mother that he wanted to be held in her arms and sleep. Tadao Hayashi kept flying, kept training, performed the role, and confided to his diary that he did not want to die. In every case, the compliance and the refusal coexist inside one person. That is the single most important thing the documented letters prove. They do not prove that the pilots were secretly all dissenters. They prove that a man could perform the role completely and reject it completely at the same time, and that the performance tells you nothing reliable about the interior. The action and the thought were separable. Some men's actions and thoughts pointed the same way. Some pointed in opposite directions. And from the outside, from the archive, from the newsreel, from the museum placard, you cannot tell which is which. That uncertainty is not a gap in our knowledge to be filled in later. That uncertainty is the permanent condition of reading these documents. Here is where I want to make a connection that you have almost certainly never seen paired with this topic. What we are looking at, structurally, is a problem of survivorship bias. the exact statistical trap that engineers ran into while studying aircraft in the Second World War. The famous version of that story involves examining returning bombers to decide where to add armor, and then realizing you must armor the places where the surviving planes were not hit, because the planes hit in those places never came back to be studied. The Kamikaze letters are the same trap inverted. We study the men who left eloquent words and conclude that the pilots were eloquent, philosophical, ambivalent. The 3,000 who left almost nothing, the majority, are the planes that never came back to the data set. Any conclusion we draw from the beautiful letters is a conclusion drawn from the survivors of a documentary filter. We must never forget the silent majority who were shot through the parts we cannot see. The comparison is worth pushing one step further, because the parallel is almost exact and the lesson is almost identical. The engineers studying the bombers were looking at a biased sample and did not, at first, realize it. The data in front of them was real, since every bullet hole on every returning plane was a genuine bullet hole. Their error lived not in the data, but in forgetting what the data could not include. The planes destroyed over the target left no holes to measure. And so the most important information, the knowledge of where a plane must not be hit, was precisely the information the sample could never contain. The Kamikaze archive works the same way. Every surviving letter is real. Every quote in this film is genuine. The error, the one that runs through most popular treatments of this subject, is forgetting what the archive structurally cannot contain, the inner lives of the men whose inner lives were never written down, or were written and then destroyed. Just as the engineers reached the right answer only by reasoning about the absent planes, we can only read these letters honestly by reasoning constantly about the absent letters, treating the silence not as empty space, but as the largest and most important part of the record. A history of the Kamikaze built only from the letters that survived is a history built from the bombers that came home. It will be beautifully detailed, and it will point in exactly the wrong direction, unless you never stop asking what is missing. If the letters are a filtered archive, the next question is obvious, and it concerns who built the filter. Most viewers of most documentaries never think to ask that question, and that is exactly why it matters. When a letter appears on screen, in a pilot's own handwriting, translated in a solemn voice, the whole presentation invites you to receive it as unmediated truth, as though the dead man were speaking directly to you across 80 years with nothing in between. That feeling of directness is the most powerful and the most misleading thing about archival material, because a great deal sits in between. A great deal always sits in between. In this particular case, the things in between are not passive, not neutral glass through which the past is simply visible. They are active hands, and each one reached into the record and changed it, keeping some things and losing others according to what that hand needed the past to say. The filter was built in at least 4 stages, by 4 different sets of hands, each with its own agenda, and understanding those 4 stages is the difference between reading these letters and being manipulated by them. Stage 1 was wartime censorship. Military censors reviewed the pilot's correspondence, and overt dissent was dangerous, which is precisely why Uehara had to hide his message to Kyoko inside a philosophy book, marking individual characters, rather than simply writing what he felt. The love note survives because he encrypted it. Think about what that means for everything the censors did approve. Every conventionally patriotic letter that passed inspection passed, because it was safe to pass. The system was selecting, in real time, for exactly the sentiments that would later be cited as proof of fanatical devotion. Some pilots found a way around the censors entirely. At Shiran, there was an innkeeper named Tome Torahama, who ran the Tomiya Inn and became known as the mother of the Kamikaze. By her family's account, Torahama smuggled and censored last words out to the pilots' families, carrying past the military the things the pilots could not say through official channels. So even within the wartime stage, 2 streams ran side by side, the censored letters that survive because they were permitted, and a thin trickle of uncensored ones that survive because one woman broke the rules. Stage 2 was the families themselves after the war. When Japan surrendered, many families destroyed the letters and cards their sons had sent, and they did it out of fear, on the strength of rumor that the occupying Americans would punish the relatives of men who had flown these missions. A second filter came down, and this one, deleted at random, wherever fear ran strongest. We will never know what was written in the letters that frightened parents burned in 1945. Stage 3 was post-war editing. The single most influential collection of these writings, the 1949 anthology Kai Watatsumi no Ko, was edited under the American occupation, and it deliberately deleted militaristic content. Phrases like 7 lives to serve the country or let us meet at Yasukuni were cut. Think about the irony stacking up here. The wartime censors cut the anti-war sentiment. The post-war editors then cut the pro-war sentiment. The same underlying letters ran through 2 opposite filters in the space of 5 years, each one removing whatever the current authority found inconvenient. The document that reaches you has been shaved on both sides. Stage 4 was the museums. The surviving letters are now overwhelmingly housed and presented by memorial institutions, chief among them the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots, which holds roughly 14,000 pieces of writing. A museum is not a neutral vessel. A museum selects what to display, writes the placards, and frames the meaning. Critics have pointed out that the museum's very name places the word peace directly against the word kamikaze, and they argue that its memorializing frame can soften the state propaganda and the aggression that produced the missions in the first place. Take the museum stage seriously for a moment, because it is the filter still operating right now, today, on visitors walking through those rooms. 14,000 pieces of writing is far more than any exhibition can display, which means someone, continuously, decides which fraction the public sees. That selection is where the framing lives. Display the letter that says grow up to be an excellent man, and you have built a shrine to devotion. Display the diary that calls the military a big fool, and you have built an indictment. The same collection can be curated into a monument or into a warning, and the visitor almost never sees the choosing hand. The visitor sees finished walls and assumes the walls are simply the past, faithfully preserved. The past, though, did not arrange itself into an exhibition. People did, with intentions, in our own time. The placard is not the pilot's voice. The placard is an argument about the pilot's voice, written by someone alive now, standing between you and a dead man's handwriting. Notice how the 4 stages compound rather than merely add. It is not that each filter removed some letters and left the rest untouched. It is that the survivors of Stage 1, the censored corpus, became the only raw material for Stage 2, and the survivors of Stage 2 became the only material for Stage 3, and so on down the chain. Each filter operated on the output of the last. By the time a letter reaches a museum wall in the 21st century, it has survived 4 consecutive rounds of selection, each one keeping and discarding according to a different authority's purpose. The odds that what remains is a representative sample of what 4,000 men actually felt are, mathematically, almost none. What remains is the intersection of 4 separate agendas, the sentences that happen to be acceptable to a wartime censor, and to a frightened post-war family, and to an occupation-era pacifist editor, and to a modern memorial museum, all at once. That is a very strange and specific filter. It is not a window onto the dead. It is the narrow set of things all 4 gatekeepers, for their own incompatible reasons, were willing to let through. Once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. Every time someone quotes a kamikaze letter at you as proof of anything, whether fanaticism, nobility, willingness, or reluctance, the first question is always the same. Which filter did this survive, and what did that filter want you to believe? Now we arrive at the fight, because the central controversy about the kamikaze is not really about the letters at all. It is about a single question that the letters are constantly conscripted to answer, the question of whether these men went willingly. The mainstream answer, in both the wartime Japanese telling and a certain kind of Western retelling, is yes. Far more men applied than there were planes. They volunteered. They went gladly. Axel and Kays, working with a conservative Japanese co-author, emphasize exactly this, that applications vastly outnumbered aircraft, and that most, in their framing, went to their deaths joyfully. Even they concede, in the same breath, that it is hard to know. Here is the contrarian angle, and it is not mine, since it is grounded in the primary evidence, and argued most forcefully by Onuki Tierney and by the documentary Wings of Defeat. The volunteering was not what the word volunteering implies. Men were, in a real sense, forced to volunteer, placed under a structure of coercion where refusing meant dishonor or worse, where the form you signed was free only in the most technical sense. The evidence for this coercion is not speculation. The evidence sits in the writing and in the survivors. Consider the single most damaging fact for the willing martyr thesis, taken straight from Onuki Tierney. When the operation was instituted, in October of 1944, not a single officer trained at the military academies volunteered. Not one. The professional soldiers, the men who had chosen the military as a career and been trained in its academies, declined as a body. The people who filled the cockpits were disproportionately the student conscripts, the ones pulled from universities, the ones with the least institutional power to say no. Listen to what those student conscripts actually wrote when they thought no censor would catch it. The diarist Sasaki called the military, in 4 words, a big fool. Uehara, the liberalist, described the special attack pilot as nothing more than a machine, an iron molecule in a magnet. That is not the language of a joyful volunteer. That is the language of a man who understands he has been turned into ordnance. There is a subtler point hiding inside the word volunteer that deserves to be dragged into the light, because the whole willing martyr thesis rests on it. When the program asked for volunteers, refusing was not a private act with private consequences. In a system built on group honor and collective shame, a young man who declined was not simply choosing his own path. That young man was marking himself in front of his unit, potentially shaming his family, and stepping outside a structure that had made dying the honorable default and living the dishonorable exception. That is what the phrase forced to volunteer actually means. It does not mean a gun was held to every head, though for some it came close. It means the cost of no had been engineered to be higher than the cost of yes, so that a frightened 20-year-old would find it easier to climb into the cockpit than to face what refusal would bring down on him and on the people he loved. A choice made under those conditions is a real choice in only the thinnest technical sense. The applications that outnumbered the aircraft, which the willing martyr thesis leans on so heavily, were produced by exactly this machinery. High application numbers do not prove enthusiasm. They may only prove that the apparatus for manufacturing consent was working as designed. The detail about the military academy officers cuts straight through the whole debate. If dying this way were genuinely the honorable culmination the propaganda claimed, the career professionals, the men who had chosen soldiering as a life and absorbed its ethos in its own academies, should have been first in line. Instead, not one of them volunteered at the outset. The men most fully formed by the military's own value system were the ones who declined, and the men filling the planes were the civilian students with the least institutional power to refuse. That inversion is nearly impossible to square with the willing martyr story, and nearly effortless to square with the coercion story. It suggests that the closer you stood to real power inside the system, the freer you were to say no, and the further you stood from it, the more the choice was made for you. Then there are the survivors, the pilots who, through weather, mechanical failure, an inability to find a target, or the surrender itself, did not die. It is worth being precise here, because aborting a mission was permitted. A pilot who could not find his target, or whose aircraft failed, was expected to turn back and be rescheduled, since trained pilots were scarce and valuable. Decades later, some of these survivors spoke. One of them, Kazuo Nakajima, put it plainly, saying that he wanted to live, that he did not want to die. Notice something important about the fact that aborting was permitted, because it complicates the coercion story in an honest direction, and we do not skip complications here. A program that lets pilots turn back for weather or engine trouble, and reschedules them rather than punishing them, is not a simple death machine with the exit welded shut. The scarcity of trained pilots created a genuine incentive to keep them alive when a mission could not be completed. That fact sits somewhat awkwardly beside the coercion argument, and intellectual honesty requires letting it sit there rather than hiding it. Look closer, though, and the awkwardness resolves into something more precise. Permission to abort a specific sortie is not the same as permission to opt out of the program. A pilot could turn back today, and still be expected to fly again next week. The exit that existed was temporary and mechanical, the bad weather, the failed engine, not moral. No form existed to sign that said I have reconsidered and will not do this. The door that opened was the one that let a valuable pilot live to be spent later. The door that stayed shut was the one marked I refuse. Both things are true at once, and only holding both gives you the actual texture of the thing. One claim here needs a flag, in keeping with how this channel works. There is a widely repeated story that a pilot who returned from too many missions, 9 in the usual telling, was executed for it. I am not going to tell you that as fact, because it appears only on forums and aggregator sites with no named primary source behind it. It may be true. It may be legend. Without provenance, it stays out of the record. And notice that the very existence of that legend tells you something about how people imagine the program worked, as a machine with no exit, even where we cannot document the specific case. The legend fills the gap between the two doors. It imagines a punishment severe enough to close the moral exit that the mechanical exit seemed to leave ajar. Whether or not any specific execution happened, the story exists because people intuit, correctly, that a program like this could not have tolerated genuine refusal for long. The legend is false as documentation and true as instinct, and we keep it clearly labeled as the former. All of that leaves the great question honestly unresolved, and it should stay unresolved because the evidence genuinely points in more than one direction. Some men clearly did believe. Some clearly did not. Most stood somewhere in a middle shaped by indoctrination, by peer pressure, by love of family reframed as duty, by a propaganda apparatus operating on very young men, and by a coercive structure that made the word known nearly unspeakable. Onuki Tierney's own careful formulation is the sharpest summary anyone has managed. The pilots, she writes, reproduced the emperor-centered military ideology in their action, though not in their thoughts. They flew the missions. That does not mean they believed the reasons. Anyone who tells you the answer is simple, in either direction, is selling you a filtered archive. There is a deeper layer to Onuki Tierney's argument, and it is the most intellectually ambitious claim in this entire field, so it deserves to be laid out carefully and then challenged, because that is what we do here. Her central concept is misrecognition. The argument runs like this. The state deployed a powerful set of symbols. Above all the cherry blossom, the image of the beautiful bloom that falls at the peak of its beauty. Official propaganda loaded that symbol with a specific meaning, the young soldier who dies gladly and beautifully for the emperor. The student soldiers, Onuki Tierney argues, did not actually absorb the state's meaning. They took the same symbol and attached to it something almost opposite, an aesthetic vision of their own youthful idealism and their own tragically shortened lives. They used the regime's imagery to mourn themselves. Onuki Tierney calls these men cosmopolitan patriots, young people steeped in Western philosophy. In Croce and Kierkegaard and Thomas Mann, who took Descartes and his line, "I think, therefore I am," as a kind of private motto, and who loved their country while seeing straight through the ideology that was killing them. It is a beautiful and humane argument, and the letters we have looked at support it powerfully. Uehara reading Croce. Ichizo Hayashi carrying Kierkegaard to his death. A whole generation of readers turned into projectiles. This channel does not exist to hand you a single tidy thesis, so here is the challenge to it, and it is a serious one. That argument generalizes from a very small and very unrepresentative sample. Remember the architecture from earlier. The men who read Kierkegaard and left diaries full of Western philosophy were the student-soldier minority, roughly a quarter of the dead. The 3,000 teenage conscripts who left almost nothing may have looked nothing like this. To take the most literate, most cosmopolitan, most self-consciously conflicted fraction of the dead and read their sensibility onto the whole population is to repeat the survivorship error we diagnosed earlier, only now dressed in sophisticated theory. It is entirely possible that genuine, unironic nationalist conviction ran far more common among the majority than the famous letters would suggest. We cannot know, precisely because that majority is silent. A thesis that can only be tested against the vocal minority is a thesis that must be held with humility. So hold both. Hold the possibility that many of these men were, as Onuki Tierney argues, private dissenters who died mouthing a creed they did not hold, and hold the possibility that this is true mainly of the articulate few, and that the silent many took the propaganda more nearly at face value. The honest position is that the letters prove the first group existed. They do not prove how large it was. It is worth naming why this particular argument matters so far beyond the specific history, because it is really an argument about how symbols work on people, and that is not a settled question anywhere. Onuki Tierney's claim of misrecognition says something unsettling and hopeful at once, that a totalitarian state can successfully compel the action it wants, since the young man does climb into the plane, while completely failing to capture the meaning inside his head. The cherry blossom falls, as ordered, yet the man falling attaches his own private significance to it, one the state neither intended nor controlled. If that is right, it suggests a real limit on how deep even the most saturating propaganda can reach. It can command the body and still lose the mind. The challenge to her thesis is equally unsettling in the other direction, since that gap between commanded action and private meaning may be a luxury of the educated, the readers, the ones with a Descartes motto and a philosophical vocabulary to build a private self out of. For the boy with no such resources, the propaganda may have reached all the way down, because he had nothing prepared to resist it with. We genuinely do not know. The reason we do not know is, once again, the silence of the majority. The very people whose inner lives would settle the argument are the ones who left no record of an inner life at all. The debate is unresolvable not because scholars are stubborn, but because the evidence that would resolve it was never written down, or was written and then burned, censored, or lost. There is one more comparison this field cannot avoid, and it must be handled carefully. Some writers have drawn a line from the kamikaze to modern suicide attackers. Onuki Tierney and the scholar M. G. Sheftel reject that equation, and they have a specific, factual basis for rejecting it, since the kamikaze struck only military targets, the warships, the naval vessels, the fleet. Others, including some reviewers of this very scholarship, draw the connecting line anyway. We are not going to resolve that here, because it is genuinely contested, and because the emotional weight on both sides is enormous. The factual distinction, military targets rather than civilian ones, belongs in the record, and what you do with it is yours to decide. Every version of the kamikaze story has a center and a margin, and it is a rule of this channel that we go to the margin, because that is where the sanitizing pressure runs strongest. Start with the pilots who were not, in the eyes of the empire, fully Japanese at all. Japan in this period ruled a colonial empire, and colonial subjects flew and died in these attacks. Korean colonial subjects were among the kamikaze dead. The counts vary, with the Korea Times giving 16, other sources saying 17, and the Japan Times 18, and the true number is, in the words of the reporting, probably higher. Give the range and name the source. Always, and especially here, where the numbers themselves form a site of political struggle. At least some of these men were coerced conscripts in the most direct sense. There is a documented account of a downed pilot picked up by the destroyer USS Lusoff Okinawa, who said he was a Korean farmer, forced to fly. And there is the case of Tak Kyonggian, who died in late May of 1945, and who, as he boarded his aircraft, sang Arirang, the Korean folk song, the unofficial anthem of a people under occupation. Think about the layers folded into that single act. A man conscripted by an empire that had colonized his homeland, flying to his death in that empire's uniform, choosing as his last audible act to sing the song of the nation the empire was trying to erase. Whatever else that is, it is not the death of a Japanese cherry blossom. It is something the official myth has no room for. The injustice did not end in 1945. Here is the detail that should stay with you. South Korea's own government has refused to classify these men as colonial-era victims, which means their families have been denied compensation. A memorial to Tak in the city of Seishin drew fierce local protest. So these pilots are trapped between two national memories that both find them inconvenient, too Korean for the Japanese myth of willing imperial martyrs, and too tainted by the Japanese uniform for the Korean narrative of resistance. They fall through the crack between two countries' stories. Taiwanese and other colonial subjects died in these attacks as well, and they occupy the same uncomfortable silence. Sit for a moment with the specific cruelty of tax position, because it exposes something about how national memory works. A nation's memory tends to sort the dead into usable categories: the heroes to honor, the villains to condemn, the victims to mourn. The colonial subject pilot fits none of these cleanly for either country. Japan's honoring myth wants willing imperial martyrs, and a coerced Korean farmer singing Arirang as he boards is a rebuke to that myth, not an ornament of it. Korea's memory of the occupation is built around resistance, and a man who died in the occupier's uniform, however unwillingly, does not slot neatly into a story of resistance. So both national memories, each busy sorting its dead into useful shapes, quietly set these men aside. The refusal of the South Korean government to classify them as colonial-era victims and the resulting denial of compensation to their families is not an oversight. It is what happens when a real human being fails to match any of the shapes a nation has prepared. Such a man is not honored, not condemned, not even mourned. That man is filed under inconvenient and left there. Then there is the largest forgotten group of all, and we have already met them, the 3,000 teenage conscripts who left almost no writing. They are victims in a sense the museums rarely foreground. Not evil, not fanatical, not philosophical, just young and conscripted and, for the most part, voiceless in the historical record. When a documentary quotes the beautiful letter of a Kyoto graduate, it is, without meaning to, speaking over the silence of 3,000 boys who never got a Kierkegaard to carry. This is the deepest reason to keep the colonial and the conscript lenses fixed on this story, rather than letting them slide to the margin where they usually sit. The famous letters are not just an incomplete record. They are an incomplete record that flatters everyone who reads it. They give us articulate, sensitive, philosophically serious young men whose deaths feel like tragedy in a shape we recognize and can hold. The silent majority, the farm boys, the conscripts, the colonial subjects who left no diary of Kierkegaard and Croce, offer no such comfort, because they offer no words at all. It is far easier to build a documentary, or a museum wall, or a national myth, around the men who wrote beautifully than around the men who wrote nothing. And so the easy story keeps getting told, and the hard silence keeps getting overlooked, and the very act of honoring the eloquent dead becomes one more way of forgetting the inarticulate ones. Correcting that is not a footnote to the Kamikaze story. It may be the most honest thing anyone can do with it. The cost radiated outward, past the pilots, into the families the propaganda promised would be honored. There is a letter at Chiran from an army lieutenant colonel named Yoshio Itsui, written to his infant son, telling the boy to grow up to be an excellent man. That is museum-curated text, and we flag it as such. The documented fact around it, though, is unbearable in a way no curation can soften. According to the Chiran Museum's own account, reported by CNN, when Itsui's wife learned of his death, she could no longer produce milk, and their infant son, the child that letter was written to, died of malnutrition 4 months later. The letter survives. The child it addressed did not. There is the true cost of the program, sitting in a display case, addressed to a baby who never grew up to read it. If you think this is all safely in the past, consider what happened when someone tried to make these letters official world heritage, because that fight is recent, and it tells you the letters are still live ammunition. In February of 2014, the city of Minamikyushu, on behalf of the Chiran Peace Museum, moved to have a set of these letters, 333 of them, drawn from that collection of roughly 14,000, inscribed on UNESCO's memory of the World Register. The mayor, Kamikaze Shimoide, relaunched the effort in May of 2015, ahead of the war's 70th anniversary, and insisted the project was in no way an attempt to glorify or romanticize or rationalize the kamikaze. The reaction was immediate and international. China's foreign ministry spokeswoman, Hua Chunying, called the bid an attempt to embellish the invasion history of Japanese militarism and to challenge the post-war international order, and she warned that it would be firmly opposed. Per the South China Morning Post, reporting South Korea's Arirang broadcaster, South Korea's foreign minister said Seoul opposed the application. on the grounds that the suicide notes went against the basic ethics of what World Heritage was supposed to mean. Here is the twist that most tellings get wrong, and it is a more interesting story than the one you have probably heard. The bid did not fail at UNESCO. It failed inside Japan. It was blocked at Japan's own domestic screening stage, a subcommittee under the Japanese National Commission for UNESCO, in both rounds. The reported reason was that the documents were explained from only a Japanese viewpoint, that their significance had not been framed in a way the wider world could recognize. Japan's own vetting panel looked at the application and declined to send it forward. Instead, Japan forwarded, and UNESCO inscribed, other documents entirely, a set of post-war repatriation records, and an old temple archive. The Kamikaze letters were never inscribed. As of now, the bid is effectively dormant, with no credible evidence of a successful resubmission. Sit with what that reveals. The obstacle was not foreign outrage, though there was plenty of it. The obstacle was internal. Japan's own experts recognizing that a set of documents this loaded could not be presented to the world as if it carried a single, self-evident, purely Japanese meaning. The very thing this film has been arguing, that these letters cannot be read innocently, that they arrive preloaded with competing agendas, is a thing that Japan's own screening committee, in effect, concluded too. Look closely at the stated reason for the rejection, because it is more precise and more interesting than a simple political veto. The documents, the panel found, were explained from only a Japanese viewpoint. That is not a judgment about whether the letters are moving or authentic or historically important. It is a judgment about framing, about the single perspective packaging that surrounded them. The panel was not saying these young men's words have no value. It was saying that to present them to the world as world heritage, you would have to account for what they mean to the Chinese cities the empire that sent these pilots had invaded, and to the Korean nation whose sons were among the dead, and to the American sailors on the ships they aimed at. A document does not become world heritage by being precious to one nation. It becomes world heritage by carrying a significance the whole world can recognize, and a significance the whole world can recognize is, necessarily, a contested one. The bid failed precisely because its makers tried to give the letters a single meaning, and the letters, as this entire film has shown, do not have a single meaning. They never did. There is a quiet irony in the mayor's own defense that is worth pausing on. Shimoid insisted the project was in no way an attempt to glorify or romanticize or rationalize the kamikaze. Take him at his word, and assume the sincerity is total. It still would not solve the problem, because the meaning of these letters was never in the sender's control. That has been the lesson from the first stage of censorship onward. What a document is used to say is decided by its readers and its custodians and the political moment, not by the good intentions of the person who submits it. A mayor cannot promise the world that 333 kamikaze letters will not be read as glorification, any more than Uehara could guarantee that his liberal essay would not one day hang on a wall built to honor the very sacrifice he described as turning a man into an iron molecule in a magnet. Once words enter the archive, their meaning belongs to whoever holds the archive next. The aftermath turned the archive into a diplomatic weapon. China responded to the broader memory contest by nominating documents of the Nanjing Massacre, which UNESCO inscribed in October of 2015. Japan then demanded reform of the entire program and, in 2016, halted its UNESCO funding, forcing a review of how contested nominations are handled. Consider the structure of that escalation for a moment, because it mirrors something from a completely different arena, the logic of an arms race. One side moves to enshrine its memory, the other side countermoves to enshrine a rival memory, and soon the institution itself, meant to be neutral custodian of the world's documents, becomes contested ground that one party defunds rather than let the other control. The kamikaze letters, written by frightened young men in 1945, had become, 70 years later, a piece on a diplomatic board where the actual pilot's actual feelings were almost beside the point. That is what happens to words when enough powers decide they mean something. The words stop belonging to the men who wrote them. Consider what these letters are, in the end. Not what they say, since we have heard what they say, but what they are used for. They are used, first, as commemoration, and sometimes as something closer to the recruitment of memory. Nationalist commemoration at institutions like Yasukuni and its Yashukin Museum presents the pilots as models of selfless sacrifice, and Reuters has reported elements of Japan's political right holding up the kamikaze as models for young people. The private ambivalence, the I dread death so much, the a big fool, the iron molecule in a magnet, tends not to survive that framing. What survives is please congratulate me. The curated archive feeds the commemorative machine, and the commemorative machine has no use for the doubt. Think about what holding these men up as models for the young actually requires. It requires the doubt to be invisible. A young person told to admire the kamikaze as an example of selfless devotion is being shown the curated letter, the one that says fall like a blossom, and is being kept away from the diary that says I want to live. The commemorative use does not merely select the willing martyr sentences. It depends on the other sentences staying hidden, because the model only works if the pilot's sacrifice looks freely and gladly chosen. Introduce the terror, the resentment, the sense of being turned into a machine, and the pilot stops being a model of anything except what a state can do to its own frightened children. So the private writing is not merely neglected by the commemorative frame. It is actively inconvenient to it, and the frame is structured to keep it out of view. Once you understand that, you understand why the recovery of the private letters is not a neutral scholarly exercise. It is, whether the scholars intended or not, a direct threat to the commemorative use, because it returns to the record exactly the doubt that the monument was built to erase. They are used, second, in the opposite direction, as pacifist testimony. The 1949 anthology that deleted the militaristic phrases did so precisely to make the letters serve an anti-war message, to turn these men into evidence of the tragedy and waste of militarism. That is a more sympathetic project, yet it is still a project, still a filter, still a decision about which sentences the dead are allowed to keep. They are used, third and most honestly, as objects of scholarship, by Onuki Tierney in her 2 books, by Sheftel, whose Blossoms in the Wind preserved survivor testimony through direct interviews before the survivors died, and by the makers of Wings of Defeat, in which 4 former kamikaze reveal, in the film's own framing, that they were neither suicidal nor fanatical. That third use is the one this film has tried to model, not to decide for you what the letters mean, but to show you every hand that has tried to decide it for you. Notice what all 3 uses have in common. Each one needs the letters to mean one thing. The nationalist needs willing martyrs. The pacifist needs tragic victims. Each reaches into the same archive and pulls out the sentences that serve. The letters are rich enough, and contradictory enough, and filtered enough, that almost anyone can find in them what they came looking for. That is not a flaw in the letters. That is the most important true thing about them. There is a particular trap waiting for anyone who feels superior to the first 2 uses, anyone who congratulates themselves for preferring the tragic victim reading to the willing martyr one. The pacifist framing feels kinder, and in many ways it is. It is still a use, though. It still needs the pilots to be a specific thing, innocent, coerced, purely tragic, and it still reaches into the archive for the sentences that prove it and passes over the ones that complicate it. A man can be a victim of a monstrous system and still, in some corner of himself, have believed some of what it told him. The pacifist reading, in its eagerness to rescue these men from the fanatic caricature, sometimes flattens them just as much in the other direction, sanding off any genuine conviction so the victimhood can stay pure. The pilots were not required to be simple in order to be worth mourning. Insisting they were victims and nothing else is its own quiet erasure of whoever they actually were. The hardest and most honest position holds them as full people, coerced and sometimes believing, terrified and sometimes resolved, machines in a magnet who were also sons and readers and men in love, and refuses to shave off whichever half spoils the story you wanted to tell. Return now to where we began. Ryoji Uehara, the 22-year-old economics student, climbing into his fighter at Chiran on the 11th of May, 1945, carrying in his own hand the argument that authoritarian states would lose, and then dying for one. We can now see that contradiction for what it is. It is not hypocrisy. It is not fanaticism. It is a young man reproducing an ideology in his action while rejecting it in his thoughts. Exactly as Onuki Tierney described. It is a man who understood he had been turned into an iron molecule in a magnet, and who went anyway, because the structure around him had made the word no nearly impossible to say, and because somewhere in the mix of coercion and duty and love and exhaustion, going was easier than the alternatives the state had left him. We can see, too, why his letter survived when 3,000 teenage conscripts left almost nothing. Uehara was a KO economics student who knew how to write, who had a news crew member to hand his essay to, whose family and editors and museums decided his words were worth keeping. Uehara made it into the archive. The boy in the next plane over, 18 years old, conscripted, inarticulate, terrified in some way he never found words for, did not. When we tell the story of the Kamikaze through Uehara's beautiful liberal essay, we are telling the truth, and we are also, quietly, letting the articulate few speak for the silent many one more time. Every claim in this film has been arranged around that asymmetry deliberately, because it is the one thing almost every telling of this story gets wrong. The instinct, when you encounter the beautiful letters, is to feel that you have finally been let into the real hearts of the Kamikaze, that behind the terrifying newsreel image you have found the trembling human truth. You have found a human truth. You have also found the human truth of a minority, preserved by a filter that favored them, and it is a subtle and seductive error to mistake it for the whole. The men who wrote nothing were no less human, no less frightened, no less worth understanding. They are simply beyond our reach, and honesty requires saying so out loud, again and again, every time the eloquent dead threaten to stand in for all the dead. The most important people in this story are the ones we cannot quote. So when Onuki Tierney writes that these men reproduced the ideology in their action but not in their thoughts, we should add one hard caveat of our own. We can only verify that of the ones who left thoughts behind. For the rest, the action is all we have. And an action, by itself, has never told anyone what a person believed. Here, at the end, is the thing that stays. We have Uehara's love note to Kyoko because he hid it inside a book, one marked character at a time, to get it past the men whose job was to make sure the last thing a kamikaze pilot said was about the Emperor and not about a woman he loved. That note survived by evasion. It survived because a dying man outwitted a censor. The thing this film leaves you with is not whether the pilots were brave or brainwashed, willing or coerced. It is something quieter, and it does not close. For every letter we have, every diary, every smuggled note, every essay handed to a news crew in the dark before a final flight, we have no way to count how many were burned by a frightened parent, cut by an occupation editor, left unwritten by a boy who never learned the words, or simply never smuggled past the censor at all. We are left to wonder what the silent majority felt, in the planes we cannot study, hid in the places we cannot see. Consider that Uehara's love note reached us only because a man about to die thought it worth the effort of a private code, worth marking characters one at a time inside a borrowed book, on one of the last nights of his life, to smuggle 4 words about love past the state. That is the level of effort survival required. Somewhere in the same barracks, on the same nights, other men felt things just as deep and had no book to hide them in, no news crew to hand an essay to, no innkeeper willing to carry their words home. Their feelings were as real as Uehara's. The difference between his survival in the record and their disappearance from it is not a difference in the depth of what was felt. It is a difference in access to the means of survival, the literacy, the opportunity, the trusted hand. History remembers the ones who had those things. It is our job not to mistake the edge of the archive for the edge of what was felt. We have the words that survived the filters. We will never have the ones that did not. And the men who could tell us are gone.